Welcome to Breakpoint this week. I'm Shane Morris, and I'm here with John Stonestreet to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Follow the stories we're talking about today by visiting breakpoint.org, where you'll find commentaries and resources every day to help you live and think like a Christian in today's culture. John, I think my favorite meme to come out of the last couple of days, I saw this morning, and it was a picture of Bill Murray from Groundhog Day, and he said, hello, folks. Good morning. It's election day again. And I could just hear the I've Got You, Babe song playing with the alarm. And it
Yeah,
feels
that's
like it's
pretty good. My favorite one so far is from our friend Ed Stetzer, who said if Chick-fil-A were in charge of counting the votes, it'd all be finished by now, and we'd probably all be enjoying waffle fries while we wait. So I appreciated that one too. It is at least at some level frustrating, understandably, for most of America. Although I do appreciate the need to make sure that we're counting every valid vote, right? I mean, that's actually what an election actually is. But man, it's taken a long time, and and we also have to do this at times because some folks are going to hear this on Friday. It is currently. This is kind of the important things when you look at memes posted of election results. You need to look at the timestamp. The timestamp of this recording is 4:00 Eastern, 2:00 Mountain Time on Thursday, November the 5th. So by the time you hear this, everything we say could be somewhere between irrelevant and changed. Because right now it's where we've been since Tuesday, which is we don't know.
We'll try to keep that in mind as we talk about this, John. We could have a clear winner by the time this airs, but I somehow kind of doubt it because we've got lawsuits coming down. We've got the counts in various states being challenged. We've got counts that could potentially go on. We're hearing for a week or more. So I'm not sure that this thing is actually going to be wrapped up by the time we air this. But
no, it's not going to be wrapped up. It's potentially the case that we'll have a front runner.
Yes.
And or we'll have the person who is going to lose it as opposed to the one who's going to win it, because of the way, I mean, it just depends. It's just amazing how long this is taking. But you're right. The lawsuits are going to go on. That's not going to be over, maybe by January. We'll see.
And I guess we always expected this to some extent. I mean, I remember posting something weeks ago about the nightmare election scenario where it's so close, it's a virtual tie, and then it comes down to a few states and recounts that are taking place there, and then both candidates sort of declaring that they're the victor or they're the legitimate next president, and then we have the litigation that results from that. So this is kind of the nightmare scenario in a way, without a clear election night verdict.
Well, it is. And even people who posted that didn't think it was the case, right? I mean, every major media outlet ran an article like that saying this could happen.
Right.
And then they posted polls showing Biden up, somewhere between 7 and 17%, including in states that were really critical. I do think that the polling industry has taken another blow square between the eyes in terms of its understanding of people, its ability to actually read the room. The willingness of people now in a hyper politicized cultural moment that we're in to share what they believe if they think it's culturally unpopular. And of course, we're certainly thinking of the quiet Trump voter. There's certainly quiet Biden voters, I would imagine, in some parts of Florida, although they didn't, there weren't as many of those. I'm sure, for example, in the villages in the center of Florida, if you're a Biden voter, you probably weren't, being too loud about it. But that's really the case. And then, of course, you've got the headlines of the bad behavior and the accusations and so on. So you're right. I mean, it's not going anywhere. But man, maybe that's the first storyline of the evening. Is again, the polls came up short, and the polls were not only were wrong, they were so wrong for so long, and communicated definitively. And we know, at least Hope listeners know, that many people in the polling industry are not reporting they're influencing, and that's actually the point. I mean, that's why they exist, and the ability to tell the difference is extremely important.
Yeah, Jim Dennison had an interesting piece where he speculated about the reason behind the inaccuracy with the polls, because I look at pollsters, and I've known a few over the years, and I don't get the impression that they're trying to get things wrong, like they're trying to throw an election by just putting lies out there. I get the impression that they really want to keep their jobs by getting it right, and you don't keep your jobs by by consistently mispredicting elections or by overestimating the support for the Democrat, for instance. So I wonder if his theory could have a lot of weight to it. You mentioned it a minute ago. It's the shy voter theory, the idea that that Trump voters feel, in particular Trump voters this time around, feel that there's such social pressure not to say you're a Trump supporter that they'll either lie to pollsters or just not talk to them. And that skews the results, even of honest pollsters, in a direction that vastly overestimates the support for one candidate. So I wonder if that's part of what's going on. I've heard a number of other theories about it, but I just I don't really buy this idea that pollsters as a group, because this whole the polling agencies all around the country got this one wrong by quite a few points. So I don't buy the idea that pollsters as a group are trying to manipulate the election consciously. They don't have anything. There's nothing in it for them, unless, of course, we see
some of them are. Some of them are actually hired by people, so their job security,
sure,
at some level relies on that. So
sure, but we even
it's
saw
not a
internal
monolithic
polling.
industry.
We even saw internal polling in the Trump campaign before the election that was saying he was in bad shape. So, and it turned out not to be nearly as true as they thought. So I'm wondering, what is the systemic problem that pollsters need to reevaluate? We talked about this.
Well,
before
one
on
thing
Breakpoint this week, I think where we said that there needed to be, if the polls were as wrong as some people expected them to be, and it turns out they were, then there needed to be like a fundamental reevaluation of how this whole thing is done. And I think we're at that point.
Have we had that conversation before? I feel like we talked about it 4 years ago. Yeah, I mean, it was a case in 16. They got a little bit better in 18, and really, I mean, just really wrong in some places. In 20, I will say this, that I do think Denison's article, and we'll link to that at breakpoint.org. Jim is a wonderful pastor down in Dallas. That's a wonderful daily commentary. That's a must read, in my opinion, along with Breakpoint. So, but Jim is fantastic. But I do think the quiet voter, the fear, and I think that reveals something that we have talked about in recent weeks, which is so much of our everyday lives right now is politicized. And there's something about saying that to people: don't let politics rule your life. There's another thing about saying politics does rule our life, because politics rules our culture. And the intentional choice of stepping away is a lot harder than people think when it's ubiquitous. In other words, this isn't something that people are now creating. Cultural forces are now driving it into people. And now, of course, cultural forces are the result of people's actions. But you have to understand, these things are reinforcing things that are, and we're pretty far down the rabbit hole in the politicization. So I think the conflict, and people that just don't want the constant conflict or have to constantly defend, or they just don't want to be all worked up all the time. The polls are going to miss those people. But one story that is emerging, Shane, and it's not as big as some people want to make it, but it's certainly bigger than other people want to make it, which is the demographic shift. Married women were thought to, that was the suburban housewife. They weren't going to come out for Trump. Married women did. Unmarried women didn't come out for Trump. The
married
Hispanic
women supported Trump to a higher degree than married men supported Trump. So Bradford Wilcox with the University of Virginia posted this on Twitter earlier, and I actually just had a conversation with him a little while ago for Upstream, and that'll be coming out in the next week or so. But yeah, he highlights this surprising fact that Trump's strongest demographic was women. And what does that mean exactly? And how does that affect this, this intersectional narrative that women have a vested interest in voting liberal?
That's right. And then, of course, when you talk about ethnic minority voters, now look, this isn't anything like Trump got the Hispanic vote or the black vote, but he got far more of it than anybody in the past. And that was in the face of a consistent cultural narrative, some justly deserved, some unjustly deserved, that, this guy's a racist, xenophobic, anti-Hispanic, anti-black president, right? That's in other words, there's more to that part of the story. And I do think that pollsters operate off worldview, right? And so we need to go back to worldview on this. pollsters operate off worldview. And right now, the dominant worldview in elite aspects of our culture, especially academia and the media, is this thing that we've been talking about for weeks, which is critical theory, this idea that the most defining aspect about one is their tribe. And there's a built-in interpretation. So it becomes polls. The challenge here is that polls can become hammers looking for nails. They're not seeking kind of the unpopular position within ethnic demographics, because the assumption is that the most defining characteristic of who one is the fact that they're a woman, or the fact that they're African American, the fact that they're Latino, the fact that they're whatever. And the Hispanic vote in particular, that's a surprising number, especially because of the anti-immigration narrative surrounding President Trump. So it makes you wonder a couple things. Number one is this theory that the most defining aspect of who we are is our self-identification or our ethnic cultural identification. That's not as true. And is that influencing the way people are asking these questions and answering them? And then the second one, which I think is really important, is there's also this idea that we want a diversity of skin color, sexual orientation, gender, but not a diversity of opinions. And so the diversity of opinions within this demographic is assumed not to exist, right? We talked about this last week with Justice Clarence Thomas swearing in Justice Amy Coney Barrett. These are two people that aren't supposed to exist. A feminist who is, procreation, shall we say, and an African American who is conservative in judicial philosophy. But they
Would
do
Justice
exist.
Barrett call herself a feminist? I haven't heard that.
No, it's just who called her that? The new kind of feminist.
Okay.
No, I'm completely imposing that one. Completely. I don't know that she'd run away from it. She's a force of nature, but that is a narrative that I think affects the polling. It certainly affects the reporting, right? It certainly affects the assumptions driving the reporting, which you can kind of see by the utter shock that Miami-Dade County brought to the entire media world. Oh, wait, where did all these Cubans come from to support President Trump? Well, they did. And it dramatically narrowed that margin, making those counties far less blue than they had been in the Clinton election. And that made the difference in Florida, at least from what we know right now.
My working theory on what happened with Latino voters is the Latinx theory, that the mangling of Romance languages for the sake of political correctness that has taken place in the last few years caused many Latino and Hispanic voters to say, you know what, I'm out. This is ridiculous. I'm gonna vote for the other guy. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, I guess it was invented in the depths of some political science department or something somewhere in some liberal arts college. But Latinx is a term that's become semi-popular on the left in recent years, and it's Latino, Latina, feminine, masculine nouns in Romance languages. Well, we're just going to say Latinx, so with an X now, so we're not misgendering them or assigning a gender to one or the other person. And of course, anyone who speaks a Romance language knows that is just absurd and laughable.
And I perhaps that's the case, but as you know, Shane and I love to bring up our personal pet peeves as explanatory things.
For those who are wondering, that was not entirely serious.
No, not entirely serious. But the point behind it is that's not the only thing, right? In other words, there's a leftist narrative, there's a progressive way of seeing the world, there's a disenfranchised, oppressed narrative that's supposed to dominate all ethnic minorities, and it just doesn't. It doesn't, at least to the person. And I wonder if it's less than what we're told. And that's one of the reasons as well. There's more to talk about, though.
And we'll talk about all of that next on Breakpoint This Week. Stay with us. We're back here on Breakpoint This Week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. John, something that we talked about going into the election was the number of ballot initiatives and amendments all around the country that were sort of up for grabs. And we have the results of those now. We can talk about how the lives of many will be altered significantly by initiatives that passed across the country. So we've got Colorado rejecting a 22-week abortion ban. 5 states, I believe, passed marijuana legalization initiatives. California sort of did a favor to the gig economy, Uber and Lyft and those types of companies by rejecting this provision that would have required them to give benefits to their employees like full-time employers. Louisiana approved significantly a sort of human life amendment is what I've heard it called. It basically clarifies the Louisiana Constitution and says this Constitution cannot be construed to guarantee the right to an abortion. So it's sort of a prep for if Roe v. Wade should
No
be
penumbra
overturned.
found here.
Yeah, no penumbra found here. Just making that explicit. It's a great disclaimer, and it means that if Roe v. Wade were overturned, nobody can argue that the Louisiana Constitution requires the right to an abortion.
Hey, for the record, I would personally pay for a billboard right on the border of Louisiana, so that when somebody's driving in, it says "Welcome to Louisiana." No penumbras here. I would pay for that billboard. So I'm just putting that out there. If there's a lawmaker, the governor of Louisiana that listens to our program, anybody like that, I will pay for that billboard just because I just think it needs to be there.
Well, John, you were pretty fired up earlier when we talked on Wednesday about the ballot initiatives in Colorado in particular. So why don't you talk about those and tell me how they're affecting you over there in your uber blue state? Because I can't understand it here. We're a red state in Florida.
Well, look, I could tell you that the purple days of Colorado are far over, but I don't just mean who's in office. I mean actually the things we're voting for, and it's not just the abortion thing, the sort of things that were voted in across Colorado. I mean, I'll just give you the punchline, and that is we're going to reintroduce wolves, to the Rocky Mountains at the expense of farmers and ranchers, but we're not going to protect babies that are viable outside of the womb. But before we get to that, though, trust me, I will come back to Colorado because I've got something to say. But before we come back to that, I do want to say that one of the observations I think of this set of ballot initiatives, and it's not just this one, it's really been the trend over the last couple of years, is that, historically ballot initiatives are things that are like, well, the legislature doesn't really have the ability to decide through these or really honestly reflect the will of the people, or, maybe it's kind of going back and forth and we're going to sell it once for all. And maybe we should go, it'd be interesting to know the history of this. And I don't, although I think it probably has something to do with the state marriage amendments, but the ballot initiatives right now, not all of them, but many of them, there's a strong mix of just straight up worldview decisions in the middle of these aren't like technical decisions. Some of them are, right? Like, how much tax for this and how much of this tax for over here. But when you start talking about, whether or not the government is going to incentivize bad behavior, when you start talking about whether things that have been considered criminal forever, are decriminalized, including cocaine and heroin use in Oregon. When you start talking about whether, it is now going to be mandated that kindergartners start sex education on LGBTQ orientation and identity things in kindergarten in the state of Washington, so that they can be taught the mechanics, let's put it that way, the behaviors starting in 4th grade, you're no longer like at the same goal as a state or as a society and just looking for the best way to get there. You're talking about radically different visions of life in the world. Now, we know that this is the case when it comes to the political parties on issues of life, on issues of marriage, on issues, around those sorts of things. But good heavens, these ballot initiatives the last couple of years have just been incredibly important. And I don't know what the punchline is other than to say, like, these down ballot issues are matters of life and death at times. They are matters of whether we're going to protect the elderly, the infirmed, how we're going to take care of the least of these, what we're going to do with criminals and incarcerated and formerly incarcerated. These are enormous decisions that are being made by voters.
I'm not a fan in general of direct democracy. I think we ought to have, representation, but this is an interesting test case for the idea that many conservatives have, and it's a challenge because I think we comfort ourselves with it, that there's a silent majority out there who, if we could just make our voices heard, all decent Americans would stand up and do the right thing. And a lot of these ballot initiatives that pass, and some of them pass very handily, really challenge that assumption in certain states. And then again, you have other ballot initiatives, and like the one I mentioned in Louisiana, where the will of the state, the people of the state is very clear that they want to protect the unborn.
Right.
They're so clear that they actually want to clarify their state constitution and say this shall never be construed to mean to mean that abortion is protected in this state. So the other story that comes out of this for me is the sort of coming apart of the nation, the regionalism that's developing, where there are certain areas of this country that are so shockingly liberal that when put to the vote, crazy liberal policies get instituted by ballot. And then there are other areas of this country where when you put it to the vote and sort of get past the political wrangling in the legislature, the people just straight up are pro-life. They're not interested in
Right.
they're instituting traditionally conservative policies. So that is an interesting measure to me of what's happening in the country as a whole. I don't know what it looks like moving forward and how these factions sort of
because they look insurmountable, right?
Yeah,
These differences look insurmountable, and we already know when you look at, in other words, what you're saying is that you can see this divide not only when you compare this presidential candidate versus this presidential candidate, but versus this, what passes in this region versus
I think
what
ballot
doesn't.
initiatives are a more reliable indicator of
because it's much more on the
are.
ground, right? It's like the House of Representatives. Can I bring up one other thing though that I think this actually reveals, or at least it's something we need to take seriously when you're addressing uh, such significant issues having to do with life, death, morality, cultural defining sorts of things on a ballot initiative. Then the tired old argument that we hear in far too many pulpits that I don't want to identify with one party or another goes out the window. So obviously people know there was or I guess it exposes what we really think on this. Let me tell you what I mean. There was obviously a lot of, folks who, pro-lifers against Trump or pro-lifers even for Biden, which that math doesn't make sense in my mind at all. But there are people who posited that, and the argument that goes back even beyond this is, things like, for example, that it doesn't matter who's in the White House because it matters much more on the ground and all that. And these are interesting conversations. I have strong views on these conversations, and and I would take a different view on almost all of them. But what gets me, and I'm speaking from Colorado here, Shane, right? Because what we were debating in Colorado is very simple. Whether or not abortion should take place after the age of viability. Now, there's a couple ways to talk about this. We're talking about, for example, unborn children who, if out of the womb, would survive in many cases, would have at least an incredible chance of surviving. We're talking about not just health concerns for the mother. That's a talking point, like back alley abortions. Very few late-term abortions actually end up being about the life of the mother, at least the physical health of the mother. We're talking about a procedure that is gruesome. And I'll just leave it at that. If you want to know, just Google late-term abortion. What happens? It has to do with basically shooting a drug through a long needle into the heart of a baby in the womb. So this is just over the top, right? Now, here's what I'm trying to say on this. Voting on a ballot initiative, or a pastor saying this is how you should vote on this ballot initiative according to the Bible, has nothing to do with aligning oneself with a political party. Absolutely nothing. You know what happened in our state? What happened in our state? You know what happened in my city? In my city, we have plenty of pastors who a few weeks ago were very outspoken, marching down the middle of the street in Colorado Springs, not just in a racial justice march, but specifically identifying with the group Black Lives Matter in a political way. The same group that have openly protested certain policies of the president from the pulpit. But when it comes to late-term abortion, it's too political. Tell me how that makes any moral sense whatsoever. What you have in Louisiana is, and we just remember, the Supreme Court just smacked Louisiana down in the June Medical Services case, 3 months ago in June? They got smacked. The Louisiana lawmakers are far, far, far more courageous and tenacious to defend human life. You might not like some of the things they say or how they say it. I haven't actually seen anything that has been too alarming, but I'm telling you, the Louisiana lawmakers are far more tenacious than most of the pastors in America. And loving, and I'm going to say it specifically, and loving their unborn neighbors.
That goes back to the issue we were discussing earlier, John, about the shy voter. Although it's not so It's not so excusable. If you're entrusted with a pulpit and you refuse to speak about one set of issues that are nonpartisan, but then you openly speak about another set of issues that are nonpartisan, but are of course associated with one side of the aisle, uh, you're in dereliction of your duty. You're not speaking meaningfully into the moral debates of the day.
It just betrays the excuse that, oh, I don't want to get political.
Right.
It just completely exposes that. Look, voting on a ballot initiative is going right to a whole group of people. And we talked about the gig initiative in California. Let me make a quick connection on this one. So California had passed a law which basically said Uber employees, Lyft employees, DoorDash, whatever, all the other gig employees had to be treated as full-time employees, which basically makes it financially unsustainable and is something that most of the workers themselves did not want. So they put it to the vote, and it not only passed, it passed overwhelmingly to reject this and return to the gig economy. Why? Why did it pass? Here are two analyses that I've heard, both of which make sense. Number one is, you know what? People really do like Uber, and we remember the old days of taxis, and we don't want to go back there. And so basically Uber said, look, if this is the way it's going to be, we can't operate here profitably. We're going to pull out of California. So that didn't go well. But you know what else happened, Shane? Now, this is really huge. Every single person in California has a smartphone. 70% of them have Uber, the app, or Lyft, the app, or Nextdoor, the app, or DoorDash, or all of them all at once right on their phones, right? So these groups got together and they decided, you know what? We are going to be a huge super PAC for this, and it doesn't matter how much money, right? Liberal, progressive employment folks could raise. You literally could not deal with the spread out on the ground reality of all the people that every time they open the app, they're getting a little ding, vote no on whatever, or vote yes or whatever it is. What was it? Vote yes on, I forget what it was, prop something, vote yes on. So, I mean, this is the perfect marketing campaign in history. This is the perfect political electoral campaign. You can't raise enough money to compete with it. You know what else is a really cool marketing campaign? You know what else has an awful lot of voters on a Sunday morning, once a week, plus an email list, plus a Facebook group that they could communicate with?
I can't think of anything.
You can't think of anything? You know what? I think just recently on a Colson Center short course and on a Colson Center event last year called the Wilberforce Weekend. And on the very first week of our prayer gathering, Pastor Rick Warren said, the most decentralized organization and most spread out organization on the planet is the church. Look, the fact that Prop 115 in Colorado passed 60-40 or failed 60-40. The fact that when you look at the money that was raised, it was stunning. Unbelievable amount of money. And one of my friends who's worked really hard, he said, look, we can't just rely on pastors to preach sermons. And I'm like, well, I don't think we've tried that option yet. Let's at least try it first, right? In other words, let's try the option of pastors actually doing this to love their unborn neighbors. I'm really frustrated, as you can tell. I'm angry about this one because this wasn't difficult. This isn't a morally voting yes on this, telling your people to vote yes on this doesn't make you a Trump supporter if that causes you problems, or it doesn't identify you with someone who only cares about people when they're unborn and not when they're born. None of this actually is relevant. I mean, it is just a very simple question, and too many pastors thought it was too political to speak up and just say the most easy thing that they could say, which is we ought not dismember little children, especially those who are viable.
And I wonder how we digest this from the standpoint of national polls, because I'm looking at a poll here on Christian Headlines. Fox News reported this as an exit poll they took after or during the election, and they found that, if I'm reading this right, close to 70% of American voters who had just voted, leaving the polling places, said that they believe abortion should be illegal in most cases. So there's a subcategory who says all or most cases, and that's 40%, so minority, and a larger category, 70%, who says that it should be illegal in most cases. Okay, so they basically picked on the typical exceptions, rape, and incest, and the life of the mother, and that sort of thing. 35% of Americans believe abortion should be legal in most cases, and only 25% indicated that they believe abortion should be completely legal in all cases. That actually sounds kind of high to me, considering previous polls on the issue. So I'm at a loss to understand exactly, unless Colorado's just super liberal, how a ballot initiative like that passes. Because remember, this wasn't an initiative to ban abortion. This was an initiative to restrict the most grisly, barbaric, monstrous
Right.
type of abortion, which, if I'm correct, is only practiced at like a couple of clinics around the state, right? I mean, how many are
Yeah,
there actually?
there's about 200 performed a year in Colorado, but
Okay.
we have a famous one. We have a Kermit Gosnell or a George Tiller in Boulder, right? Surprise, he's in Boulder.
Yeah.
So that we have that. And to be clear, this was a ballot initiative to restrict, so it did vote no. So the fact that it didn't pass is the thing that is surprising. Just
Right.
Just getting, and I know these things are hard to track. So yes, Colorado is a progressive state. Yes, especially down the 25 corridor. Colorado Springs is not the conservative hub that it used to be. Denver. I mean, we had protests downtown, anti-government protest in downtown Denver on Wednesday night when actually things started to look more favorable for Biden. So it's just, I don't know. That's Denver. There's a whole lot of people that smoke a whole lot of weed here, so that might have something to do with it. I don't know. But what you find is, I'd say it's three things. Number one is the silence of churches. I go back to this. Keith Green said this, that the silence of churches is why abortion clinics are allowed to stay open. If that's true of any abortion, it's certainly true of this most grisly thing that most people disapprove of. The second thing I'll say is that opponents of Prop 115 just flat out lied. They talked about it as if it would rob women. So, and all of this is just super inconsistent, right? Because if abortion doesn't actually take an innocent human life, why would anybody be against it for any reason, right? It doesn't make any sense. On the other hand, if, as opponents said, there's not that many abortions, or this is just in, random cases, then why would they just flat out lie, which is what the opponents of Prop 115 did, and say that this is actually about stealing a woman's right to an abortion? It's the slippery slope. You can't allow any foot in the door. And the third thing is there's this really morally and logically inconsistent view that's deeply held by a whole lot of people in America who would say, I'm personally pro-life, but I don't want to, and fill in the blank. I'm personally pro-life, but I don't think you have to vote that way. I'm personally pro-life, but I don't think you have to, but I don't want to make it illegal for anyone else. I'm personally pro-life, and it's kind of like the three exceptions to being a pro-lifer. Have you heard about these? The three exceptions? I oppose abortion in all cases except for rape, incest, and my case, right, except when it comes to me. And so that legal get out of jail free card is what a lot of people are very, very hesitant to vote against.
Well, I'm sure we'll be talking about this and other issues for weeks to come, John, as the ramifications of the election unfold and as the election itself potentially continues to be litigated for weeks to come. But we'll cover it all right here on Breakpoint this week. Well, John, we have one more story we want to hit this week, and it has to do with the Supreme Court, which really got lost in the midst of the election chaos, and not many people talked about it. So I was glad to see we addressed it in Breakpoint. It's a religious freedom case. It's called Fulton versus City of Philadelphia, and I'll let you talk about it because it's gonna have significant import for this issue that we talk about all the time on the program for a long time to come here.
Yeah, so this is the classic case of a city trying to force Catholics not to be Catholics. We've got examples of this, or Christians not to be Christians. In this case, Catholics not to be Catholics in the city of Philadelphia. So you've got essentially Catholic Social Services, which has operated in the city since, get this, Shane, 1797. That's how long they've been in the city, right? I mean, one could argue they predate almost every other institution there. And of course, they didn't start out being a foster care organization, but that's one of the main things that they do in the city of Philadelphia is place needy children in foster homes. And the city just basically decided you've got to change your mind. Even though they've never been asked to place children in same-sex households, they had to change their policies or they could no longer exist, at least in that line of work. And they said no. We've seen this happen in Michigan. We've seen this happen in other cases. It's important to note, too, that we've seen this happen, for example, in Michigan, and we saw a Christian adoption agency decide to change their policy. Really disappointing, because I think what we're going to see, first of all, by the way, we saw it with the Catholic Social Services in that same state, they ended up winning. And look, it's hard to predict based on oral arguments what's going to happen in a decision. That's kind of like predicting what's going to happen in an election from the polls. Maybe a little problematic, but this was pretty overwhelming. Like, I think what we're going to see is a vindication of Catholic Social Services, that the city of Philadelphia will be ruled against, and that they're going to be able to continue to exist and do their really good work, which tells you, look, don't give up the territory. Don't be a jerk. Don't yell and scream. Understand what might come with this risk. Count the cost. But you know what? It's too soon to just kind of completely, give up on the face of this. So that's the first issue in this case. But it's an important one, which is, look, I think the court's going to come down on the right side of this one.
I'm interested in the way that Roger has this thing he talks about. You guys in your discussion, he mentioned it. It's the law of merited impossibility, and that goes something like this. It's ridiculous to think that religious freedom will ever be curtailed in the way you're saying, silly Christian. But when it does happen, you'll deserve every bit of it. That's and that's the sort of thing that I see unfolding here. I remember, I just turned 32, John, but I remember not too long ago when the promise was, well, look, just let us enact this agenda. Let people live and love as they choose. Give women the rights that they deserve. All this stuff, whatever the agenda is and how it's sold, and we'll leave you alone. You leave us, live and let live. That was kind of the promise, and that's consistently been proven wrong, because as these social causes have advanced in the sexual revolution, we see a steady and consistent encroachment on explicitly religious organizations, whether it's the Little Sisters of the Poor or this foster care organization. Catholic organizations have been at the forefront of this, because I guess they're very commonly in these positions, and they've also got the legal resources and gumption to stand up against it and take it to the Supreme Court. And so far, it's been, that's yielded a lot of fruit. But it just puts the lie to the idea that that this campaign has been all about live and let live. It hasn't. It's really been about pushing a uniform social agenda on everyone. And if you don't comply, then so much the worse for you.
Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Alito both mentioned something along those lines, that, this wasn't about the rights of same-sex couples. Justice Kavanaugh said it was about the city of Philadelphia looking for a fight, creating a clash. Justice Alito put it this way: this case was never really about ensuring that same-sex couples in Philadelphia have the right to be, or the opportunity to be, foster parents. Instead, the city just can't stand the message that Catholic Social Services and the Archdiocese of Philadelphia are sending by continuing to adhere to the old-fashioned view about marriage. And that's probably where this is going to go. When you hear this sort of language, there's enough precedent laid because of the Masterpiece Cake Shop. And, I always joke that Justice Kennedy's legacy is no animus here. And, that's the thing he wanted. He wanted everyone to exist with no animus. And so that's where we got the Masterpiece Cake Shop decision. It really didn't rule that Jack Phillips had the right to operate his business the way that he wanted to, or the way that he deeply believed. It just ruled. And by the way, of course, they were talking about a for-profit company or for-profit business, as opposed to a nonprofit, not only a nonprofit, but a directly church-related nonprofit. But the clear ruling there is that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission had a responsibility as a prior condition to their engagement with Jack Phillips to treat him with respect and to treat his religious freedom his religious convictions with respect, and they didn't. So we didn't even get to let's say the freedom of speech issues and the freedom of religion issues. Other than there's kind of the respect of religion issue. And that seems to be where, if nothing else comes into consideration, this is going to be ruled in the favor of Catholic Social Services, because Philadelphia's just been really kind of obnoxious on the whole deal. There's plenty, for the record, as in the case with Masterpiece, there's plenty of other providers in the city of Philadelphia. In other words, it's not a public accommodation issue where, this is the only game in town. There's a whole lot of other organizations that do this, but there's a deeper thing at work here too that's worth mentioning. And I did talk about it on Breakpoint on Thursday. And if people want to come to breakpoint.org, I'll link to it. And it has to do with the worst decision ever received from Justice Antonin Scalia. Now, Justice Scalia is a conservative hero because Justice Scalia did an awful lot and did an awful lot well. But there was a decision called Employment Division versus Smith, and it had to do with an obscure religious belief of a group of Native Americans, and had to do with the use of peyote.
The peyote case, yeah,
the peyote case. And basically, it just ruled that on a local level, that as long as there was universal applicability, then the state government had a right to infringe on religious freedom of any group. Now, at the time, no one really thought a whole lot about it, other than, man, if we're ever in the minority, that could come back to get us. Well, we're in the minority, and the attorneys for the Catholic Social Services, which I think was a mixture of folks from both Beckett and from ADF. I didn't look very closely. I do believe Mike Ferris, president of ADF, was one of the attorneys representing this case. But one of the things that's interesting is that the attorneys have asked them to reconsider Employment Division versus Smith, because it's hanging out there as kind of a get out of jail free card. And essentially, the state doesn't have to justify its infringement on religious freedom, in any sort of real way. Now, that's different than federal law, right? Because in federal law, if the government, U.S. government, infringes on religious liberty, it has to show that they have a compelling interest in order to do so, and that they are carrying it forward in the least restrictive way possible. Now, you remember the Hobby Lobby case, Shane?
Right.
Which is, all right, the government says we have a compelling interest to provide birth control to everyone everywhere who's female or identifies as female. So we're going to do it through employment healthcare plans and make the employers pay for it. That was, the HHS mandate in Obamacare. And what did the Supreme Court rule? They ruled, essentially, the opinion was, okay, you could probably say they have a compelling case. I'm not sure I agree, but okay. But this is clearly not in the least restrictive way possible. And that's why Hobby Lobby won. Remember how that went down?
Yeah. That test was applied. So what you're saying is that the tests are different on the federal and state level. So the tests
are different from the federal and state level. That's right.
The bar that states have to clear in order to infringe on religious liberty is much lower than the bar the federal government has to clear.
It is. That's right. And in fact, Employment Division versus Smith says, basically, if they choose to restrict religious freedom, there's the only requirement is that it does so in the least restrictive way possible. It also, by the way, suggested that the only way that such a restriction can be challenged by someone is if they can point to some other right being violated. So you remember in the Masterpiece Cake Shop, it wasn't just freedom of conscience in terms of religion, it was freedom of speech.
Right.
Jack Phillips should not be forced to communicate something that's against his deeply held beliefs, right? Freedom of speech is not only the ability to say what you deeply believe, it's the right to not have to say what you don't believe, right? That's for freedom. And so they appealed, Kristen Wagner and the attorneys at ADF appealed to the freedom of speech. That has something at least to do with Employment Division versus Smith. So that's what's at case here. Now, we made a prediction, Roberto and I, and we went back and forth on this. And the prediction is that we're probably going to get another kind of Masterpiece Cake Shop, because first of all, the court has been very, very reticent in recent years to do any sort of sweeping cases when there is I don't want to say a get out of jail free card, but a technicality that prevents them, or that removes the obligation to rule broadly on something, right?
So Jack Phillips had basically got out of it by saying that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission had showed not irrational animus, but what was the phrase that got used?
I'll use this.
They were just jerks.
They were just jerks over and over and over again. No, that's right. And they were just relentless, and they wouldn't leave them alone. And yeah, that's right. And there's enough of that in this case to show that there is a, kind of a strange targeting. It's unnecessary, and so on. So my guess is, and here's the other interesting dynamic, is that this is one of the first cases, not the first case. I think I actually said that in the commentary, but it needed to be corrected because it wasn't the very first case, for Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who has, at least in previous decisions, been really clear on religious freedom issues. She's, for example, some of the articles that came up during her confirmation trial had to do with the Hobby Lobby case, had to do with how the court had ruled on Obamacare, all kinds of things. But she's also a protege of Antonin Scalia. So immediately, as the attorneys for Catholic Social Services argued, like, look, we hope you take down Employment Division versus Smith, or at least take it on. But even if you don't, there's enough evidence here, of maltreatment. Then Justice Amy Coney Barrett asked, well, if Employment Division doesn't apply, why would we take it on? So, this is going to be interesting to watch all this play out. I do think we'll get a win, and it'll be a win for religious freedom. And I'll just read how I closed it, our breakpoint commentary, because I do think this is the punchline, and we'll see come June. Given the perceived animus toward Catholic Social Services, the majority probably won't need to overturn Employment Division versus Smith to send a strong message on behalf of religious freedom in this case. At the same time, we've already had, such as in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, a ruling about government animus toward religious conviction. What we need now is a ruling that protects the rights of religious organizations and individuals to operate according to those convictions, while limiting the government's ability to trample on them whenever they want. So that's, I think, where we got to get to, but we'll see how it happens. And of course, we bring that up because it's an extremely important case. And all of us were watching, flipping back and forth from CNN to Fox to see who was going to call Wisconsin and Michigan first.
John, that was the most I've ever heard a non-lawyer talk about a Supreme Court case.
Do you like that? That was pretty. Was it clear? It was
clear, though. It was meaningful, and it shows how it applies to all of us and why we should all be, anticipating this decision to see what comes down from the court.
Well, look, I'll read another paragraph out of this.
Oh no, he's going to talk more about it.
Yeah, now we're going to talk more about it. We're off radio now, so we can go as long as we want. This is huge because, as both attorneys pointed out, as both Kavanaugh and Alito pointed out, we were assured in decisions, especially in Obergefell, that anyone holding traditional views of marriage would be respected. That's what you were saying earlier, right?
Right.
We were told that their, same-sex marriage won't affect us, that their rights would be upheld, but they haven't been. And so that's why Kavanaugh and Alito both said, look, this is a case of Philadelphia picking a fight. They have grounds to pick a fight because of Obergefell. And so we're going to have to settle this. So I hope they do.
Yeah. And I'll add one more thing, John. This is the reason, and this piece of legislation is not going to pass anytime soon because of the way the election came out. The Congress is never going to, it's never going to get through Congress. But the Equal Rights,
Equality Act.
The Equality Act, yeah, that's what it's called. There's a provision in there where it says that this is not going to, in essence, this is not going to affect religious organizations. So churches and charities and so forth, it doesn't apply to them. So they can still discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity or what have you in their employment. I don't believe it for a minute. I don't believe it for a minute because of the kind of bait and switch that we've seen happen again and again and again. The merited impossibility that's happened again and again. We're literally seeing we in the last few years we've seen a group of nuns sued to make them supply contraceptives to their employees. We're seeing Catholic adoption and foster care agencies being sued by cities to provide services to gay couples. And so I don't believe this idea that we're dealing with an agenda that's just going to be content to dominate the public square and then leave religious people alone in our own little silos to play by our own rules. I don't believe it for a minute. So I think this is a fight we'll continue to see in the coming years. Thank God it's not going to be a fight that we'll probably see, at least not a legislative or judicial level at the federal government in the near future. And
you can't trust it, and you can't trust it because the punchline of the HHS mandate story was not just that nuns were being forced to provide birth control. I mean, as if that weren't enough of a punchline. That's not the key punchline. The key punchline that a lot of people have forgotten is that Kathleen Sebelius, the secretary of HHS at the time, defined what a religious institution was that was exempt and what it wasn't. And guess what? It wasn't your 501c3 status. It was based on just incredibly
it basically only allowed houses of worship, if I remember correctly. They were the only ones
small houses of worship that did not have any outreaches to people who didn't already agree with them.
Right.
So look, now what's that do to a Saddleback church in Lake Forest, California, Rick Warren's church, that has a free healthcare clinic, all, that serves thousands of people a week in Southern California?
You know how many churches run soup kitchens?
Well, I mean, based on the letter of the law, if you teach your people to evangelize, you don't qualify in that, right? Because you're actually trying to reach out. If you have like a invite your lost neighbor to church Sunday, then you're actually trying to reach people who do not already previously agree with you. And so this is why something like the Equality Act, which says, don't worry, you guys can do whatever you want. The first thing it does is it sets anybody that is a religious institution, an entity that is lucky enough to get that exemption, that means you're a bigot, right? This is kind of like, we'll let you live here, but that's about it. But you're a bigot. And then second, who fits in that category? Who gets allowed to play by those rules? You can just define that down to non-existence. And that's what we already saw hints of in the HHS thing. So and by the way, that's not what the First Amendment says. That's the other thing. The First Amendment doesn't say I have to justify being religious. The First Amendment says the government has to justify having a problem with me being religious. And it's the burden of proof is completely different.
Oh, we got a little bit of time left here for recommendations, John. My recommendation this week is going to be something that you will not hear me do very often. I do this very selectively, but I'm going to recommend a self-help book because I'm pretty critical of the genre as a whole. I'm not a big fan of it because it tends to sort of encroach on religious territory and make pie in the sky promises. But this one's good and it's a classic. And I just read this several weeks ago. And I greatly enjoyed it. It's Dale Carnegie's How to Stop Worrying and Start Living. You probably know his name from the book How to Win Friends and Influence People, which is another good one I found on the steps of a dorm room one time, abandoned. So I picked it up and read it and just loved it. But he wrote in the early part of the 20th century. He died in the 50s. But this is a very good, I think it's a manifestation of common wisdom or common sense. It's conversant with Christianity. And it's full of proverbial insights about how to overcome worry and anxiety in your life. And some of these insights that he uses are, cultivate gratefulness, understanding how low the chances are of bad, dreaded things happening to you in your life, not worrying about things that you can't control. I can't help but look around us at the election season and just think, my goodness, we need a lesson on how to stop worrying and start living. And I'll tell you one of the anecdotes he shares in the book. That's what part of what's so great about it. It's just anecdote after anecdote that illustrates the points he's making. But one of the great anecdotes he shares is he's walking down the street one day and he's in just a cloud of worry. He's miserable over his circumstances, something stupid from work. And he sees this war veteran coming toward him he has no legs and he's wheeling himself along on this little makeshift cart that this was days before wheelchairs were widely available. He's wheeling himself along. He gets off the cart, puts it up on the curb, and then climbs up on the curb to get back on the cart. And he says he looks at him and he has the biggest smile on his face. And he's like, "How's it going today, neighbor?" And it's this beautiful moment that immediately turned for Carnegie into shame, because he's like, how dare I walk down the street in a cloud of worry and sorrow and misery and self-pity when this guy can manage to be happy and cheerful and loving toward his neighbors. I have no right to act that way. Absolutely no right. And that was a great reminder. It's just sort of a kick in the pants. It's not a believe in yourself and follow your dreams kind of book. It's very practical stuff your grandfather would tell you. And this guy is a liberal Christian. He seems like kind of a liberal mainline Christian, sort of social gospel stuff. But the wisdom in there is timeless, very helpful, and I can't recommend the book enough.
What's that date? What's that book date to?
I think he wrote it in the 40s.
40s. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's really something. Speaking of people who don't have the reason, as many reasons to be cheery as I do, and is still way more cheery than I am. That's a good introduction and a pivot to my recommendation, which are two resources having to do with the election. Now, again, assuming we don't know when you guys listen to this, as opposed to when we record it, we don't know. We don't know what the uncertainty is. We don't know what sort of resulting chaos, whichever way it goes, is gonna happen
That's
in
why I recommend
America.
stuff from the 40s.
That's why you do. Well, I'm going
It'll
to
still be
recommend stuff from
relevant.
last week, literally stuff as new as last week that also I think are helpful in those same veins. The first one is Johnny Erickson Tada's prayer time that she contributed. It's a video. As many of you know, we've been doing a weekly prayer gathering. We wrapped it up this week on Wednesday, every Wednesday since, I don't know, it's been 11 or 12 weeks now. And because of her health condition, which many people know, she's a paraplegic. She's also survived breast cancer twice, I think. Johnny Erickson Tada, just one of my friends, and I mean, the fact that I can call her a friend is one of those things, because a better description for her, for me, is a hero. And she's been extremely kind to my kids. But I asked her to participate in this, and she said, that time of day, which is 7:30 Pacific, it's just, her routine and getting up and what that requires for her. She's like, I just can't do it. But she contributed a video, and we sent that video out over the weekend. I'm hoping that many of you got it and you saw it, but if not, we're going to link to it at breakpoint.org. And it's just a remarkable 10 or 12 minute encouragement. It's about a 10-minute prayer. That just will, heaven came down and glory filled my soul. How about that? And she sings a couple times in it, as Johnny is wont to do. And it's always great.
If you've never been to an event with Johnny and heard her say, before we get started here, why don't we just sing a hymn? And then she breaks out into some
National Religious Broadcasters is a gathering once a year, that has to do with Christian media, radio, and so on. The most well-attended and popular event of, we're talking about thousands of people there, is the hymn sing with Johnny Erickson Tada every year. So that's just something, she just brings the house down. Also, I would say the other resource was our prayer time on Wednesday with Ed Stetzer, who's the director of the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College. He just basically prayed us through Isaiah chapter 6. If you don't know Isaiah 6, the year that King Uzziah died, basically a year of political chaos, and just walks through the rest of it and what that means for us. And I thought it was a wonderful reminder of a number of things. Number one, that it's chaotic on earth. It's not chaotic in heaven. The throne room looks the same, and it's calm and still, and the person on the throne still forgives sin, and he still calls you to action. And you put all that together, and Ed prayed us through that. We put the recording of that on a special episode of the Breakpoint podcast. I hope it showed up in your feed already. If it hasn't, it will in the next day or so. And you don't always pay attention to special episodes, but I'm telling you, this one is worth the price of admission. So Ed Stetzer and Johnny Erickson Tada, I think, both give you things that are just extremely helpful in dealing with these uncertain times. So that's my recommendation for the week.
Well, that about wraps it up for today. Visit breakpoint.org for links to all of the stories and resources John and I have mentioned today on the program, plus a wealth of always fresh resources to help you live and think like a Christian in today's culture. For John Stonestreet and the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next time.